They said no one could survive this desert. Ethan whispered it to himself, voice swallowed by the roaring wind as he stumbled across the sun-baked dunes, each step sinking a foot deep into the scorching sand, boots caked and hot, the air shimmering with heat, the horizon a blur of golden waves under a sky that burned white. His canteen was empty, the bite of thirst sharp on his tongue, and yet he moved forward, driven by the stubborn pulse of survival. The ruins of what had once been a supply drop lay half buried behind him, twisted metal reflecting the harsh sun in jagged shards, a silent warning. Ahead, a glimmer caught his eye, something that moved with impossible grace, a figure stepping lightly atop the dunes, skin like molten crystal, reflecting the sunlight in fractured beams. Liara paused, eyes locking with his, wide and piercing, filled with a mixture of curiosity and caution, as if weighing whether he was a threat or an anomaly. And in that instant the desert seemed to hush around them, the wind holding its breath. Ethan raised a hand instinctively, not to attack, but to signal peace, lips dry, chest pounding, pulse thundering in his ears louder than the howl of the sandstorm beginning to form. A low hum vibrated through the air, soft at first, then rising, a resonance that made the hairs on the back of his neck tingle, as if the desert itself recognized her presence. Every detail was sharp, the glint of light off her crystalline shoulders, the ripple of sand beneath her feet, the heat radiating from the dunes in waves. Ethan stepped closer, boots sliding slightly on the loose sand, and the figure did not flee. Instead, she tilted her head, examining him with the patience of someone who had seen worlds die and been born again. And for a fraction of a heartbeat, he felt a connection that went beyond words, a recognition of life struggling against the odds. The sun dipped lower, streaking the sky with molten amber, and shadows stretched long and thin, painting patterns over their faces, catching the tension and anticipation between them. Ethan reached into his backpack, pulling out a small water packet, holding it out slowly, the movement deliberate, offering help in the only language he knew, action. Liara's eyes flickered, the hum dipping and rising like a note suspended in the wind, and she stepped forward cautiously, the sand compressing softly beneath her, her gaze unblinking. Around them, the desert seemed to pulse, the distant storm curling and bending light into patterns that danced across their skin, a silent audience to a fragile trust being formed. Ethan's throat was dry, yet he managed a breath, steadying his hands, trying to communicate that he meant no harm, that survival here did not need to be a contest. Liara's lips parted, a soundless exhale, and for the first time, a subtle shift softened the edges of the encounter. Tension remained, but the harsh desert light now carried a glimmer of possibility, a story waiting to unfold, threads of fate weaving invisibly through the heat waves, and Ethan knew that whatever came next, the desert would test them both, pushing limits, revealing truths, and that this chance meeting was the spark that could ignite something neither had expected. The wind continued to whip across the endless dunes as Ethan and Liara moved slowly toward a rocky outcrop that promised a brief reprieve from the scorching sun, each step leaving deep impressions in the sand, the heat rising in visible waves that distorted the horizon and painted the desert in shifting shades of gold and amber. Ethan carefully offered the water packet again, his hands steady despite the exhaustion that pressed against his muscles and made his movements sluggish, and Liara regarded the gesture for a long moment, her crystalline skin catching every glint of sunlight, eyes narrowing slightly, as if weighing the sincerity of his actions. Finally, she took a tentative step forward, her fingers brushing the edge of the packet, a silent acknowledgement that trust was tentative but possible. They settled beneath the jagged shadows of the rocks, the temperature dropping marginally in the shelter as they both exhaled breaths they had been holding unconsciously, the only sounds the distant hum of the approaching storm and the soft shifting of sand against stone. Ethan removed a small, lightweight sensor from his pack, its surface gleaming under the desert light, and began checking the air and soil readings, moving with precise, deliberate motions that suggested familiarity and care, while Liara watched silently, her presence at once watchful and contemplative, the subtle rise and fall of her chest betraying the curiosity that she was struggling to conceal. The shadows deepened, stretching long over their faces, creating a play of light that highlighted the contours of Ethan's tired but determined features and the striking alien symmetry of Liara's form. The desert around them transformed into a living backdrop, a participant in the fragile dance of understanding that was unfolding. As minutes passed, the wind softened, carrying fine particles of sand that shimmered in the late afternoon sun like tiny stars scattered across the dunes, and Ethan gently opened a small rations pack, offering a morsel of nutrient paste to Liara, who hesitated for just a heartbeat before accepting it, her fingers brushing his hand briefly, a contact fleeting but electric, an unspoken connection forming without words. They sat together in a quiet rhythm, movements synchronized with the subtle shifts of the sand and light, Ethan adjusting his gear while Liara observed, occasionally shifting to catch the sun's reflection on her skin, a silent learning of each other's presence and intent, until the sky began to deepen into shades of orange and crimson, the desert taking on a surreal glow, the distant rumble of the storm growing sharper, and a sense of fragile camaraderie emerged, not built on shared language, but on the mutual recognition of endurance, resilience, and the small acts of care that bridged worlds apart, setting the stage for the challenges and revelations that the desert would demand in the hours to come. The sun dipped lower behind the jagged peaks of the desert, painting the sky in deep shades of crimson and violet, while Ethan adjusted the strap of his pack, his fingers tracing the worn fabric as he scanned the shifting dunes for any sign of safe passage. The wind cooler now, but still carrying fine particles that made the air shimmer. Liara moved beside him, steps precise and deliberate, her crystalline skin catching the last rays of sunlight, casting reflections across the sand that danced like firelight, and Ethan found himself drawn to the rhythm of her presence, a silent measure of caution and grace. They reached a narrow crevice between two towering rocks, the space offering shelter from the gathering storm, and Ethan crouched to examine the footing, testing each stone with careful weight before signaling Liara to follow. She moved with a fluid elegance, eyes scanning every shadow and glint, and when she paused to tilt her head toward a subtle change in the wind pattern, Ethan understood her concern without a word being spoken. Inside the crevice, the temperature dropped slightly, the stone walls absorbing the fading heat of the day, and for a moment, silence settled between them, broken only by the soft hiss of sand blown by the wind outside. Ethan unrolled a small thermal blanket and offered it toward Liara, who regarded it curiously, her fingers brushing the edge before she allowed herself to be partially covered, the gesture tentative but accepting the unspoken trust being extended. He then set a small sensor on the ground, its lights flickering, scanning the air for signs of the approaching storm, and Liara leaned closer, watching the tiny device blink and hum, fascinated by its simplicity and its function, her head tilting in a gesture almost human in its wonder. As shadows lengthened, Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the exhaustion in his legs and arms, yet a quiet determination held him upright, a commitment to continue despite uncertainty, while Liara mirrored his posture, her luminous eyes reflecting the faint orange glow of the horizon. They shared a rhythm in the stillness, an understanding that words could not convey. The desert outside vast and indifferent, yet inside the crevice, a fragile alliance formed, based on observation, action, and the subtle communication of intentions. The wind began to shift again, carrying cooler currents from distant dunes, signaling that the storm would arrive soon, and Ethan stood, brushing sand from his knees, motioning for Liara to move, guiding her along a narrow ledge that overlooked a deeper valley below, the scene bathed in the violet and amber of the dying sun. In that fleeting moment, the enormity of the desert pressed around them, yet the presence of each other provided a tether to something steady and alive, the foundation of trust slowly taking root, and as they prepared to descend into the uncertain terrain, both recognized that the journey ahead would demand patience, awareness, and a willingness to act with care, forging a connection that neither fully understood but both felt, a silent promise carried by the wind through the endless dunes. The first drops of the desert storm began to fall as Ethan led Liara along a narrow ridge, the air thick with the scent of warm sand and distant ozone. each step careful to avoid loose stones that could send them sliding into the valley below, and the wind whipped around them, carrying with it the low, rhythmic hum of the desert that seemed almost alive, resonating against the rock faces and through the thin layers of fabric covering Ethan's arms. Liara moved with a grace that contrasted sharply with Ethan's cautious, deliberate pace, her eyes constantly scanning for changes in the light, in the texture of the sand, in the shape of distant dunes, and she occasionally extended a hand to indicate a safer path, her fingers brushing his arm lightly, the gesture silent but filled with intention and a growing sense of understanding. They reached a shallow alcove carved by centuries of wind, and Ethan crouched to set down a small, solar-powered sensor to monitor the approaching storm, its blinking lights reflecting off Liara's crystalline skin, casting dancing patterns on the jagged rock walls. She knelt beside him, her head tilting as she studied the device, and for a moment, the intensity of the storm outside was tempered by the quiet focus of shared observation, their breath visible in the cooler pocket of air that the alcove provided. Ethan unrolled a thin thermal mat, and together they shared a small portion of ration bars, the simple act of eating side by side creating a rhythm of companionship without words, a small island of normalcy in the vast, shifting desert. As the sky darkened, streaked with deep purples and muted oranges, Ethan adjusted the angle of a reflective panel to catch the last rays of sun, and Liara observed, her luminous eyes tracking each movement with curiosity, occasionally mimicking his actions with small adjustments to her own posture, as if learning not just the practical steps but the intent behind them. The wind rose again, carrying grains of sand that sparkled like tiny gems in the dimming light, and Ethan felt the familiar thrum of adrenaline, not from fear, but from the heightened awareness that comes with being responsible for another life in a hostile environment. While Liara's presence added an element of unpredictability, her reactions measured and deliberate, yet full of quiet energy that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the storm. They stayed in the alcove, side by side, listening to the changing patterns of wind and sand, each moment reinforcing a fragile trust, an understanding that survival depended not just on physical endurance, but on observation, careful decision-making, and the willingness to act for another being without expectation of reward. And as the shadows lengthened and the first flash of lightning illuminated the distant dunes, Ethan realized that the storm, with all its chaos and intensity, was shaping a bond between them that would carry them through the trials yet to come, a bond built on patience, shared effort, and the quiet recognition of life persisting against the odds. The desert night settled around Ethan and Liara with a quiet intensity, the sky a tapestry of stars stretching endlessly. The wind softened but still carrying the subtle hiss of shifting sand, and Ethan adjusted the strap of his pack, checking the small sensors he had placed earlier, their faint blinking lights mirrored in Liara's reflective eyes, creating a pattern of movement and color across the rocks that surrounded them. Liara crouched beside him, observing the readings with a careful focus, her head tilting slightly as she processed each flicker of information, and Ethan noticed the way her posture reflected both curiosity and caution, a silent dialogue forming between them that required no words. They moved carefully through the rocky terrain, guided by the dim glow of the sensors and the faint outlines of dunes illuminated by moonlight, every step deliberate as they avoided unstable surfaces and small crevices hidden beneath thin layers of sand. Ethan paused occasionally to adjust the angle of reflective surfaces to maximize the moonlight on the path, while Liara mirrored his movements with subtle shifts in her stance, her luminous skin reflecting the faint light like polished glass, creating a mesmerizing interplay of shadows and highlights that emphasized the alien elegance she carried effortlessly. The wind carried cooler air down from distant ridges, bringing with it the scent of distant rocks and sparse vegetation, and Ethan inhaled deeply, feeling a surge of awareness, every sense heightened by the combination of fatigue and the stillness of the night. Liara stepped forward to test the firmness of a narrow ledge, her toes pressing lightly into the sand, and Ethan watched her, understanding her careful assessment of risk without a single word exchanged, the rhythm of movement between them now synchronized, a tacit agreement that each action mattered. As they reached a wider plateau, The stars above reflected off pockets of quartz in the rocks, scattering points of light that danced across their faces and bodies, and Ethan offered a small ration of nutrient gel, which Liara accepted after a brief hesitation, her fingers brushing against his in a gesture that conveyed both trust and recognition of shared endurance. They rested briefly, side by side, listening to the soft murmurs of the desert, the wind shaping dunes and whispering through rock formations, a living reminder of the vastness that surrounded them and the fragile connection they had forged through careful observation, mutual assistance, and silent understanding. With the storm long past and only a faint hum of residual energy in the air, Ethan stood and motioned for Liara to follow, leading her along a narrow path toward a distant ridge that promised a clearer vantage of the desert ahead, their shadows stretching long and merging with the contours of the terrain, a visual testament to the partnership that had begun to form, built on patience, respect, and the subtle recognition that in a place this unforgiving, cooperation and attention to each other's presence were the true measures of survival. The first light of dawn crept over the desert horizon, casting long, delicate shadows across the undulating dunes, and Ethan felt the cool morning air against his skin, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat of the previous day, every breath sharp and invigorating as he scanned the landscape for the safest path forward. Liara followed closely, her movements precise and measured, her crystalline form catching the soft gold of the rising sun and scattering tiny fragments of light onto the sand, creating patterns that shifted with every step and every change in her posture, drawing Ethan's attention to the subtleties of her presence. They reached a narrow canyon where the wind funneled through tight rock walls, creating a low, resonant whistle that mingled with the distant echo of shifting sand, and Ethan paused to adjust a small sensor he had planted earlier, its faint hum blending with the natural symphony of the desert, while Liara crouched beside him, observing quietly, her eyes reflecting both curiosity and cautious understanding. The canyon opened gradually to a wider plateau, the terrain smoothing out under layers of fine sand that glimmered with mineral deposits, and Ethan led the way carefully, testing each step for stability, guiding Liara with subtle gestures that she mirrored intuitively, their movements synchronized without need for words, a silent rhythm forming between them. As they progressed, Ethan shared small morsels of ration bars, passing them to Liara, who accepted each offering with a thoughtful glance, her gestures deliberate and measured, a reflection of the trust that had been growing steadily since they first met, each action reinforcing their unspoken connection. The sky continued to brighten, soft blues and pale oranges painting the canvas above, and the desert seemed to breathe around them, the sand shifting and settling in response to the wind, creating ephemeral patterns that reminded Ethan of the fragility and beauty of the environment they navigated together. Liara paused at the edge of a ridge, tilting her head toward a distant formation of jagged rocks, and Ethan understood her silent signal, adjusting his pace to approach the site, noticing the subtle way she examined the terrain, the angle of the sunlight glinting off her reflective skin highlighting the contours of the rocks and sand in ways that made the landscape almost otherworldly. They rested briefly in the shade of an overhang, the temperature cooler, the scent of warmed stone mingling with the faint trace of desert flora carried by the morning breeze, and Ethan adjusted his pack, ensuring their supplies were secure, while Liara observed the movement with keen attention, as if cataloging every detail for future navigation. Together, they continued onward, moving with quiet deliberation, each step measured and careful, every glance exchanged full of understanding and anticipation, the desert stretching infinitely around them, a vast and testing environment that demanded awareness, patience, and cooperation. And in this shared journey through the dunes and canyons, they discovered a growing bond of trust, a rhythm of mutual respect, and the quiet exhilaration of survival in a landscape that challenged every sense, while rewarding those who paid attention to its nuances. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the desert in deep shades of amber and violet, while Ethan adjusted his pack and scanned the shifting dunes for the safest path, the wind carrying the faint scent of heated stone and distant minerals, every breath crisp and dry in his lungs, and Liara moved beside him, her crystalline skin reflecting the fading light in fractured patterns that danced across the sand, a silent reminder of her otherworldly presence. As they descended into a narrow valley, the terrain became more uneven, with loose sand and scattered rocks requiring careful footing, and Ethan extended a hand toward Liara, guiding her across a tricky patch where the sand threatened to give way, her trust implicit as she matched his pace. A sudden surge of wind lifted small grains of sand into the air, creating a hazy curtain that blurred the lines between sky and earth, and Ethan paused to observe the patterns, noting subtle shifts in the sand that indicated hidden dips and unstable surfaces, while Liara crouched slightly, her luminous eyes catching every glint of light on the moving grains, analyzing the landscape with an intensity that rivaled his own. They reached a small plateau with a view over the valley below, the rocks forming natural steps that could lead them to higher ground, and Ethan carefully tested each surface before moving forward, signaling Liara with precise gestures that conveyed both caution and encouragement. She followed, her movements fluid and deliberate, occasionally reaching out to steady herself against the jagged stone, and in that silent rhythm, a sense of partnership had formed, built on observation, action, and mutual awareness, each step a testament to the trust growing between them. The sky above shifted to deeper purples and indigos, and the first stars began to shimmer faintly, their light reflecting off Liara's form and casting ephemeral glimmers across the sand, creating a scene of surreal beauty that seemed almost suspended in time. Ethan set a small sensor at the edge of the plateau, its blinking lights faint against the dimming landscape, and Liara leaned close to examine it, her head tilting as she absorbed the information without comment, the quiet focus between them conveying more than words ever could. As the wind softened, they took a brief pause, both breathing steadily, their shadows stretching long across the textured sand, the vastness of the desert surrounding them, yet made intimate by the companionship they had forged. With careful deliberation, Ethan led Liara along a narrow ridge that promised a safer route toward distant higher dunes, each step measured, each glance acknowledging the other's presence and intent. And in that shared journey, the harsh, unforgiving desert transformed from an obstacle into a landscape of connection, awareness, and the quiet, unspoken affirmation of life persisting in unexpected ways. The trust between human and alien solidifying in the fragile, shifting light of twilight. The morning light filtered softly through the thin veil of desert haze, illuminating the plateau where Ethan and Liara paused to catch their breath. The wind gentle yet persistent, shifting fine grains of sand across the surface and catching the glint of Liara's crystalline skin, scattering prismatic patterns that danced across the rocks around them. Ethan adjusted his pack and scanned the distant horizon, noting the subtle ridges and dips that marked their path forward, while Liara crouched nearby, head tilted as she observed the movement of sand and light, her eyes reflecting understanding and an unspoken acknowledgement of the partnership that had formed between them. As they prepared to move along a narrow ledge that edged the side of a vast canyon, Ethan extended a hand toward Liara, guiding her carefully across a stretch where the sand gave way slightly, her trust implicit as she followed, each step synchronized in a rhythm born of shared awareness and careful attention. The sky deepened into soft hues of peach and lavender, the sun low yet warm, and the air carried a faint metallic scent from distant mineral deposits, every inhalation sharp and vivid, reinforcing their alertness as they navigated the rugged terrain. Liara paused to examine a small outcrop, her fingers brushing against the stone as if sensing its density, and Ethan watched, noting the delicate precision in her movements, a contrast to the rugged determination in his own, yet complementary in their efficiency and focus. They reached a slight depression in the plateau, a natural shelter that offered a temporary respite from the gusts of wind sweeping through the canyon below, and Ethan lowered his pack, offering a ration bar to Liara, who accepted it after a brief pause. The act both practical and symbolic, a continuation of the trust and mutual care they had cultivated over the hours. Shadows lengthened, stretching across the sand and rocks, painting the landscape in soft contrasts that highlighted contours and textures, and Ethan felt a quiet exhilaration at the beauty and stillness, a rare moment of reflection amid the relentless challenge of the desert. Liara stood beside him, her head turning to follow the distant ridgelines, her eyes catching the light and revealing subtle nuances of expression that conveyed wonder, curiosity, and tentative admiration. And in that shared gaze, Ethan sensed a deeper recognition, a silent understanding that their journey together was not just about survival, but about connection and insight into another being entirely different, yet unexpectedly familiar. As they prepared to continue along the plateau toward a more defined path leading to the upper dunes, the wind whispered across the rocks, carrying hints of the coming day and the possibilities ahead, and Ethan felt the quiet affirmation of their bond, a combination of careful observation, shared experience, and the subtle acknowledgement that the desert, vast and indifferent, had become a place where trust, patience, and mutual respect could thrive in the space between one life and another. The desert stretched endlessly before Ethan and Liara as the sun rose higher, casting long, golden beams across the dunes that glittered with heat and reflected in the crystalline facets of Liara's skin, making her appear almost ethereal, a living prism in the vast, undulating landscape. Ethan adjusted his pack, feeling the strain in his shoulders and legs from the continuous trek, yet a steady determination kept him moving forward, each step deliberate and cautious as he navigated the shifting sand and rocky outcrops. While Liara matched his pace, her movements fluid and precise, a quiet grace guiding her along the safest route. They reached a high ridge that offered a panoramic view of the desert valley below, and Ethan paused to take in the scene, the wind carrying the scent of hot stone and distant minerals, swirling around them in a rhythm that seemed almost alive, and Liara stood beside him, her luminous eyes reflecting the vast expanse, a silent understanding passing between them that words were unnecessary. The terrain ahead was marked with undulating dunes and scattered rock formations that would require careful navigation, and Ethan began plotting the safest path, pointing toward natural corridors and ledges that would minimize the risk of slipping, while Liara observed attentively, tilting her head and adjusting her stride in response, her focus both analytical and intuitive, a blending of alien perception and human trust. As they moved along the ridge, the wind shifted, carrying fine grains of sand that caught the morning light and scattered across the rocks like tiny sparks, and Ethan noted the patterns, guiding Liara around subtle dips and hidden crevices that could challenge their footing, each movement an unspoken dialogue of awareness and consideration. They paused again at a small plateau with a natural shelter formed by layered rock, the temperature slightly cooler and the air filled with the soft hum of the desert. And Ethan offered a small ration bar to Liara, who accepted it with a careful hand, their eyes meeting briefly, a quiet acknowledgement of the trust and connection that had grown steadily over the hours of shared endurance. From that vantage point, the vastness of the desert seemed almost infinite, yet in the presence of one another, the expanse became a landscape of possibility, a stage where careful observation, patience, and mutual respect allowed them to navigate challenges that would have been insurmountable alone. And as they prepared to descend toward a lower ridge leading into a canyon that promised shelter and a path forward, both felt the subtle satisfaction of understanding and cooperation, the bond, formed in the harsh beauty of the desert now unspoken but undeniable, a recognition that survival was not merely a measure of skill or endurance, but of empathy, awareness, and the quiet acts of care extended between two very different beings learning to move together through a world as unforgiving as it was magnificent.